Hello my dears, how's it going? What's new? What's shaking? That was good. I'm very excited to have you here. It's been a bit since my last video essay, but I'm excited to talk to you about it. Hopefully this lighting and setup works. If it doesn't, I'll change it next time around. Still have to test some stuff out with my new apartment, but we'll see how it goes. Anyway, today we're going to talk about the first trans clinic and how it was destroyed, because every now and then I see like the occasional screenshot or really vague infographic about it on Instagram, and I've always wanted to know more about it, so here we are. I know that my channel usually is in the realm of disability history and media, not queer stuff, but queer identities have been medicalized for so long that there is significant historical overlap between the two communities. Also, all oppression is connected, and also, like, who cares what the genre of my channel is? I'm just here to have fun and learn stuff. Also, I am a white person in my early 20s with light brown shoulder length, a little longer than shoulder length, curly brown hair, and I am wearing a hunter green, I guess, button up, and I'm sitting in front of a wall that has some paintings on it behind me. Now, this video was initially meant to just tell the story of Magnus Hirschfeld and the Institute for Sexual Sciences, but then I ended up going down a rabbit hole of wider trans history, trans medicalism, and the fluidity of gender today and in the past, so I'm going to try to figure out how I can tie those in where I can here. But first, let's talk about Hirschfeld, and then we'll move on from there. Actually, yeah, hold up. General content warning first, because content warnings are important. Trauma-informed practices are sexy. Trans and queer history were generally not a lovely time. So there's going to be light discussions of homophobia, transphobia, some outdated terminology, eugenics, Nazis, the Holocaust, and self-unaliving. I know that's a cringy word, but I really need to not get demonetized. As always with my content warnings on this channel, I only include potentially traumatic information when it feels necessary for a specific educational reason, and I try to keep it as minimal as possible. That is the case in this video as well. Alright, so Magnus Hirschfeld was born into a large Jewish family in May of 1868 in what is now Poland, but was then Prussia, which was a part of Germany because wars and stuff. He initially studied philosophy and philology, and he got his medical degree in 1892. Also, if you're wondering what philology is, I googled it. It's the study of languages, but in a historical, like, think linguistics mixed with history, mixed with literary criticism, mixed with a little bit of etymology, which now that I know it's a field, I will be looking further into this because that's my stuff. Anyway, one particular story that came up in a few places in my research is that in one of his classes when he was in medical school, they were learning about mental disorders, and the professor brought in a gay man who had been living in an institution for many years because of his sexuality, who was paraded in front of the class like a zoo animal. Hirschfeld was very distressed by this experience, and also by the fact that nobody else seemed particularly bothered by it, and it very much stuck with him. I don't know if at this time he knew he was gay or not. I wasn't able to find really any records of him being explicitly open about his own sexuality in text at the time, but either way, this was a very important part of his life and very much crafted his outlook on the world. Not to like completely sidetrack here, but I found it really interesting that this was an experience that he wrote about, because obviously I haven't had that exact same experience because that's kind of absurd and no longer really happens anymore. But in psychology classes today, there's still a lot of things where people will be like, we're going to teach you about a case study and show you this example of a case study, and it will just be like horribly offensive and over the top and dehumanizing, and you'll just look around and everybody else in the classroom is just like, yep, that checks out, that's fine. And you're like, not only am I upset by watching this, but I am upset by everybody else thinking that it's okay. And I feel like that's happened a lot in my education. I know that's happened a lot in the education of other disabled people that I know who have studied psychology and medicine. And I just think it's an interesting parallel that that type of experience still happened in the past and still happens in the present, and like the importance of trauma-informed teaching and acknowledging that minority people might actually be in your classroom. It's just very interesting. Schools have been a mess forever, basically, is what I'm saying. Again, as I said earlier, I don't know if at the time he knew that he was gay because I couldn't find records of him saying that. I couldn't find very many records at all of him being explicit about his own sexuality, but there are so many photos of him holding hands with his partner, so it's very clear that he was, and he did talk about it in some senses. I just like couldn't get my hands on it. The interesting thing about researching this guy is that every single video and article you find says the same maybe 15 to 25 things about him, and occasionally you'll find an extra little snippet or two of information in one that isn't in any others, and it's impossible to track it down in any other references to it because every time you Google a certain thing you end up being directed to the copious amount of articles that all say the same exact 15 to 25 things. But the other cool thing about this guy is that he did write down everything, meaning that likely there is significant reference to his own homosexuality in his writings that I just didn't come upon because there was far too much to go through. And also not all that's translated into English, and my German is sketchy at best. But what I loved about him keeping track of things is that his motivations are very clear. There are so many moments in his story where several different sources will be like, he made the decision to have this forward-facing public opinion because he assumed that it would make people think this way, which would then convince them to act this way towards this group of people. I'm gonna give more examples of that later, but I'm just kind of obsessed with the fact that this guy played the long game for gay rights and meticulously planned through his actions and kept track of them about like what he would do, how it would be perceived, how he needed to act for certain perceptions to happen, how he wanted other people to perceive him. It's just incredible and very meticulous, and I respect it. Anyway, I keep getting sidetracked, and I will continue to through this entire video. So Hirschfeld got his medical degree, yay for him. He then traveled around the United States, where he discovered that the homosexual subculture in the US was very similar to the one that he experienced in Berlin, and also very similar to the one that he knew about in Paris, which made him start to wonder like, maybe queerness is universal. So he then started going to various expositions that had human zoos, i.e. people from around the world in cages on display. If you want to learn more about the history of freak shows and like colonialism and how they connected to freak shows, I have a video about that up here. And he would ask them through their translators about homosexuality, where they were from, and then he took notes on that as well. Hirschfeld was also very much impacted by the trials of Oscar Wilde, who, if you did not know, went to prison due to charges of sodomy, i.e. being gay. I'm not saying Wilde was a martyr for the cause. Gayness aside, some of his relationships had some weird age gaps and power dynamics. That's a discussion for another day. But Hirschfeld wrote a lot at the time and after the fact about this case. It also very much impacted his work and how he thought about the world. And in 1896, he published under a pseudonym for safety a book titled Sappho and Socrates, one of, if not the first texts to openly suggest that queerness was a normal part of humanity and there's nothing wrong with it, saying that gay people are acting in accordance with their nature. That same year, he moved his medical practice from Magdeburg to Berlin. He treated a lot of patients who struggled with mental health issues, and he noticed that a lot of his gay patients took their own lives, wanted to do so, and or had scars from attempts. And I couldn't find a specific date for this particular story, despite it coming up literally everywhere that I learned about this guy. But there was one gay soldier who went to Hirschfeld and was really struggling, and he ended up taking his own life on the eve of his wedding day. And in his note, basically said, he hoped one day Hirschfeld would be able to make it so that people like him could be seen as humans. Hirschfeld felt a lot of guilt that he was not able to save this man's life, and as we will see when we talk more about his ideology in a bit, his number one goal with literally everything he did was just to lower rates of people taking their own lives, but this also impacted his work significantly. In 1897, he created the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, which is a group of physicians who hoped that by creating scientific proof to the validity of queer people, it would lead to cultural understanding and decriminalization. They fought for the repeal of paragraph 175, a section of the German Penal Code that criminalized homosexuality. They gathered over 6,000 signatures from prominent Germans, Albert Einstein being one of them, to try and get the government to repeal this bill. They were unsuccessful, though in the 1920s when they reintroduced the bill, it actually made a very great deal of progress, but then the Nazis took over and kind of put a stop to that. Around this time, Hirschfeld became the first person to provide data that gays were more likely to make attempts on their own lives, using it as evidence that under the current social conditions, life was literally unbearable for the German gays. I would assume that around this time was when he officially became known as a sexologist, i.e. somebody who studies sex and sexuality. Maybe it was before this. A lot of his earlier history is very muddly. He also joined the League for the Protection of Mothers, helping them campaign for the decriminalization of abortion and against policies that banned many kinds of working women from getting married. He also argued with a bunch of anthropologists that black women and German women are virtually the same biologically and we should be treating them as such. That was cool. We will talk more in a bit about how we need to remember that Hirschfeld was an imperfect man and a man of his time, particularly when it comes to eugenics. Now seems like a good time to sprinkle in the fact that he genuinely did think about, and he also wrote about, potentially outing government officials who were voting no on legislation to try to get decriminalization of gayness passed, because he thought that ruining their lives would be better for the greater good. Not to ruin all the amazing, wonderful things about him, but after that paragraph of describing him, I can hear her being like, a man, the late 1800s saying these things about minorities? What an angel! Hold on to that for a little bit. He's still amazing. Don't get me wrong, like net positive, but we do need to remember that he was not a perfect guy. And we should not be looking at him as such. We shouldn't be looking at any people as perfect people, honestly. Anyway, so when World War I began, Hirschfeld was initially quite pro-war. Based on his own writings, he figured that if he was super patriotic and, yeah, Germany, he would show that gay Jewish Germans could be good German citizens too. But then he became a medic in the army, he saw a lot of things, and then he started printing a whole lot of pacifist pamphlets. Also, when he was in the field as a medic, he kept getting court-martialed out of the field to testify as a sexology expert in court cases. So he was kind of doing double duty at the same time. Also, a quick sidebar that's kind of related, but kind of not really, but also I want to talk about it, so here we go. During the First World War, there was an internment camp on the Isle of Man, that's near England, if you're wondering, called Nakaloe. I googled it. I couldn't find answers and I didn't write down the pronunciation when I was listening to the audiobook, and I'm not going to go searching for that again. Anyway, It was there from between 1914 to 1919. It had about 23,000 civilians and 3,000 guards. They were men aged 17 to 55 who were from Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Whether they were on holiday or whether their families had emigrated from mainland Europe 3 centuries ago, if they were assigned male at birth and of military age, and they had, whether deliberately or not, never acquired British citizenship, they were considered a potential threat. Now, the reason that I bring this up is because this internment camp became a very interesting case study in sexuality and transness, and Hirschfeld at least was somewhat aware of this via letters he received, and it may have impacted his research. But also I think it's really cool, and it's in the time frame, so we're including it. Basically, during their years of internment, one of the biggest attractions for men at these camps to take them out of the boredom and torture of their time there was theater. Every single week there would be a new show, tons of men would become actors, and they performed mostly comedies. And they needed people to play the women, so some of the people performed in drag. And many of the people who performed in drag realized that they felt happier and more like themselves when wearing drag. And so offstage they continued dressing and acting that way and just became women in this men's camp. And most importantly, the rest of the civilians at the camp were generally pretty chill about it. One lieutenant wrote a letter to the German sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld to say that he'd seen a drag show and he thought that the performer was probably expressing their real self on stage, and that was why their performance was so convincing. Now, the book that I've been quoting from is called Before We Were Trans by Dr. Kit Hayam. I already raved about how great it is on my Instagram story, but it breaks down the history of gender nonconformity in a way that isn't like, here's a list of people in history we could classify as trans today, but rather like a holistic discussion of the fact that language changes meaning, that gender is related to culture and time period that a person is in, and how we can see examples of gender nonconformity in the past as telling us that humans are inherently varied and helping us to better understand ourselves in the present without claiming ownership over people and labeling their identities, but rather welcoming them into a wider understanding of community and humanity. I don't know if that entirely made sense, but if you like the aspects of my videos where I state a bunch of things as separate examples of a phenomenon and then bring in so much nuance to a point where I've completely muddied the waters, yet everything somehow makes more sense at the same time, this is the book for you. It does that, but with gender. I listened to the audiobook on Audible while reading through the physical copy. I cannot recommend it enough. We're going to talk more about this book later, but if you want to learn more about the Nakolo pronunciation ? Internment camp, go to chapter 3 of that book. It's all about it. It's really great. And yeah. Now, what's interesting about this example of Nakolo is that it shows how much drag and transness are not mutually exclusive. A common transphobic myth is that trans women are just men in drag, which is inherently a harmful idea, assuming that a trans person is just wearing a costume and will always be their gender assigned birth underneath that. And because of this, and also RuPaul, the understanding has kind of shifted all the way in the other direction in seeing the two as very mutually exclusive, which is harmful and also inaccurate, because for many people, drag creates a safe space to experiment with gender and try different things out and see what does and doesn't fit. I mean, even gender aside, performance and costume is a way to try on different versions of oneself and see what you can learn from it and take what fits and leave what doesn't. It's one of the reasons I love performing and costuming so much. Also, drag isn't exclusively over-the-top feminine. It can be anywhere within and outside the binary. It's a whole lot more nuanced and complicated than we think it is. I'm gonna end my little rant on drag there. I do at some point want to learn more about the history of drag and how that has impacted the way that theater functions today, particularly Broadway. Maybe I'll make a video about that if people are interested, but I just found the story of gender nonconformity and acceptance within the same time frame as Hirschfeld in a different place, and also known about by him, to be very interesting, and wanted to mention it for anybody else who might also find it interesting, and also to plug that book because you should go read it. Okay, so World War I happened. After the war, we saw the rise of the Weimar Republic, the first time Germany had been a constitutional federal republic, and it was a little rocky at first, but it gave way to the Golden Twenties, a period of time known for financial stability, freer laws, women gaining the right to vote, and rise in the arts and humanities. Think German Expressionism, Modernism, Dadaism. For the theater nerds, Laban and Bertolt Brecht were during this. Also, paragraph 175 was not repealed, but it was kind of really terribly enforced, which gave rise to a more openly queer subculture. Things were not perfect, but they were definitely on the up and up. And then the Great Depression happened and the Nazis took over, and we'll get to that. Now, during this period, Hirschfeld purchased a building in the Tiergarten district of Berlin, which became his Institut für Sexualwissenschaft, or the Institute for Sexual Sciences. It's really hard to switch between English and German, I'm so sorry, which opened in July of 1990. And this institute had literally so much going on. First, we have the archives, a massive library and archive of research on sex and sexuality, including medical records, photos, notes, books by all kinds of authors, and his own personal writings. There was also the Museum of Sex, which was open to the public and taught about sex and sexuality. There was a lecture hall where they would give talks and offer educational services. There were also medical offices where they treated alcoholism, venereal diseases, gave gynecological examinations, ran marital and sex counseling, offered access to different kinds of contraception, held support groups, and offered surgical and endocrinologic care for trans trans people. And they were also rooms for rent, with many trans folks living there as their safe haven. And Hirschfeld also lived with his partner on the second floor. Now, many of the employees, such as maids and secretaries, were trans patients of Hirschfeld who struggled to find employment elsewhere as a result of their gender identities, so they instead worked there. And the support groups and therapy in particular were focused not on conversion, but on helping gay people find others like them and learn coping mechanisms to be able to survive in a homophobic society. The gender-affirming surgeries that were done at the Institute were some of the first of their kind, done by gynecologist Ludwig Levy-Lenz and surgeon Erwin Gorbant, including bottom surgery for trans women, facial feminization and facial masculinization, as well as hair removal treatments. Most of these were more or less completely experimental at the time, often done because the patients incessantly asked for them. They were often quite risky, but so many people wanted and needed gender-affirming care so badly that they just kind of figured it out. So like they were kind of guinea pigs, but it's complicated. They also offered hormone replacement therapy at the time. Hirschfeld was initially against these surgeries, but once he learned that they significantly reduced suicide rates, he was all for them. One of the first women to receive this kind of surgery was Lily Elbe, who you may know as the protagonist of The Danish Girl. I don't know anything about that movie, and there's a strike going on, so I'm not going to talk about it anyway, but I'm just connecting some dots for people if people want to connect those dots. It was initially based on a book, and in the realm of, wow, Hirschfeld and his institute have been scrubbed from history as much as humanly possible, his name is actually never once mentioned in the text. Hirschfeld also worked with local authorities after the continual arrest of various cross-dressers and trans people to create transvestite passes, which were written passes issued by the institute that could be shown to police who might be trying to arrest them for cross-dressing to basically say, hey, I'm accounted for, please leave me be. Also in 1919, Hirschfeld co-wrote and acted in a film titled Anders als die Andern, or Different from the Others, which is one of the first films ever written for cinema with a homosexual character. It was about a man who was blackmailed into coming out, and then after coming out his life fell apart, his career was destroyed, and so he ended up taking his own life. Hirschfeld played himself in the film. The purpose of it was to try and sway public opinion toward the support of gay people in hopes of overturning paragraph 175, which, again, is very explicitly written out about how these things were the explicit goal of the film. I love it. Like, please, the universe should be more transparent about their motives behind things. Because we don't have to sit here and think, did he mean to do this, or was this a accidental byproduct? We know what he wanted. He wrote it down. Thank you, sir. Another fun fact about this film is that the main character of it, the gay one, was played by Conrad Veidt. Casro has a great video about him that you can watch up here. It's also linked in the description for you, but he was a bisexual icon. He married a Jewish woman, and when anti-Semitism was on the rise in Germany, fled with her to Britain and later the US. He knew as a German man in Hollywood that he was most likely going to be cast as Nazis in future films, so he declared that if he were to play a Nazi, it must undeniably be the villain of the story. He became most famous in the US for his role as Major Strasse in Casablanca. I don't know if I pronounced any of that right, I've never seen that film, donating his money from the film back across the ocean for the war effort to overturn Hitler. Unfortunately, he died before he could see the fall of the Reich, but regardless, he was incredible. And wow, look at gay history all being interconnected. Wild. If you want to watch Anders als die Andern, the whole thing is on Vimeo for free, and I've linked it below for you. Also, I know it's in German, but it is a silent film, so you don't need to know the language to understand it. That's why I love silent films. 2 years later, after this film was released, Hirschfeld ran the first international conference for sexual reform on a scientific basis, which later became the World League for Sexual Reform, a group centered around legislation for more openness around sex and sexuality, the right to contraception and sexual education, as well as gender equality. As anti-Semitism began to rise exponentially in the Weimar Republic, with the gay Jewish Hirschfeld being a very great scapegoat for people in power to use about the corruption of Germany, he went to America in 1930, where he was known as an expert on romantic love and did all kinds of marriage counseling and whatnot. In 1931, he went on an Asian tour, one that I won't go explicitly into each place that he went and what he did, but the general vibe is that he would show up at a country, learn about things, give some speeches about how sex is important and colonialism is bad and women should be able to vote, and then he would end up having to flee to a different country, and then he would do the same thing, and then flee, and he kept moving around. It was kind of his thing. Again, I kind of respect it. He kept trying to go back to Germany. He really wanted to go back to Germany, but he kept being told it was not safe, and unfortunately he would never return. In 1932, there was a bit of a coup situation. The Weimar government started to fail a little bit, during which time paragraph 175 suddenly became very enforced and police began harassing people associated with the institute. The following year, at the end of January, the Nazis took power. On the 6th of May 1933, Nazis stormed the institute, beating people up, smashing things, stealing all of the books, and announcing that it was closed permanently. 4 days later, all of the books were burned in one of the first and largest of the Nazi book burnings. It is estimated that anywhere from 12,000 to 25,000 books and records were destroyed, including artistic works, photos, and medical records. A bronze bust of Hirschfeld was reportedly put on a staff and paraded around before being unceremoniously chucked into the fire. The bust actually ended up surviving and is now in a museum. It is likely that many of the trans people living in the institute at the time were killed during the raid, and the rest, including the doctors, were sent to concentration camps. Various purges of gay men from the Nazi Party followed this and were presumed to have been possible due to the medical records seized from the institute. Some of the most famous World War II footage and photos of book burnings are the footage and photos from this event, and nobody really knows about that. Just another piece of the Institute's history deliberately lost and forgotten. Hirschfeld, still out of the country, learned about this from a distance. He ended up settling in France and continued writing on his social justice issues. He tried to re-establish the Institute in Paris, but was unsuccessful, and as his health worsened, he moved to Nice by the coast and died in 1935 on his 67th birthday. So that's the story of the Institute for Sexual Sciences. But let's talk a little bit about what Hirschfeld believed. Now, the core of most everything for him was that love is the driving force for everything humanity does, and that love is natural and normal, and therefore homosexuality and gender nonconformity are perfectly natural and normal. And also that what is natural cannot be immoral. He believed that every human trait existed on a scale from masculine to feminine, and that everyone is some blend of the two, creating 64 possible types of sexualities. He acknowledged that not all experiences are fixed, meaning that gender and sexuality and whatnot can be fluid and ever-changing, that somebody can be interested in more than one gender, etc. He also coined the term transvestite. It is now used as an outdated term and often slurred to mean a person wearing the clothes primarily associated with another gender, often to refer to men in dresses, but at the time he used it, it was to refer to anybody who regularly and voluntarily wore clothing associated with the other gender, regardless of sexuality. He didn't love the term. He felt like clothes were just one part of gender identity, but it was the one that he used at the time. He also coined the term transsexual for someone who had undergone gender-affirming surgery and made very clear distinctions between transsexuals and intersex people, which is something that is still not even done today. Many of Hirschfeld's successors agreed with his idea that there's a spectrum of gender and sex from masculine to feminine, but they concluded that the far end of each, i.e. heterosexual male and heterosexual female, were superior and everybody else was not, treating them as deviant and mentally ill. But Hirschfeld did not feel that way. He just wanted his patients to feel more like they were truly themselves and live happy and long lives. Some of his stuff doesn't really hold up to scrutiny today, such as the idea that gay men are natural because they are inherently more feminine and experience things like occasional back pain and mood swings, which are characteristics of menstruation, and that's why they are gay, which, yikes, but it's very clear that he was trying his best to find concrete, undeniable biological evidence that he could use to prove that scientifically queerness and transness make sense, which led him to some truly wacky conclusions and some very misguided research, but we can't totally blame him for that. Most of his ideas are shockingly modern and progressive given their time period. For example, his statements on race. He wrote a book creatively titled Racism, about what he called racial theory, writing about how the fact that we divide people into so-called biologically different races is a method of control, a way to consider prejudice as fundamentally moral and correct and validated by science, despite having no real science to its name. He wrote about Western imperialism and how our ideas of modernity were fundamentally created to make it seem like the white man is more advanced than other races and to consider others to be barbaric and uncivilized rather than another kind of human, to further uplift and justify white supremacy. Again, very, very progressive for his time. But let's talk about eugenics, because as wonderful as he was about race and gender and sexuality and reproductive rights, he was kind of ableist. Not in the sense of like, we should forcefully sterilize people, but in like a, here's a published list of the undesirable types, the kind of people that one should avoid marrying to have the best and most prosperous offspring. He in fact connected eugenics to sexology, suggesting that nature created homosexuality as a way to prevent some people from having degenerate offspring. Given the rest of what he stood for, it doesn't seem to me like he meant that in the sense of like, trans and gay people are degenerate, their genes shouldn't be passed on, more of like a, if some of the population never marries the other gender, it means that there are less available partners for certain people to procreate, which will overall help the population, if that makes sense. I'm not sure, that's just my own personal conjecture and understanding of it. I personally think that the way he handled eugenics against disabled people in comparison to his objectively medicalized view of queerness and transness is a bit of cognitive dissonance in his own work to me. So I don't really understand how he could say some things that were super medicalized as good and normal and natural, but others also medicalized as degenerate and a problem and should be eradicated. But then at the same time, I've met a lot of doctors and many of them say very, very similar things today, so maybe it does make more sense than I think it does. I won't go on a whole rant about eugenics and the legacy of eugenics here, and also genetics, which is the legacy of eugenics. I have a very long video about that, which you should check out. I've linked it above, but it seems very clear that Hirschfeld felt like he was helping humanity by preventing high levels of pain that he associated with disability, and didn't quite connect the dots or realize that there was some dissonance going on there between his understanding of transness and his understanding of queerness and of disability. But let's take the time here to talk about how Hirschfeld did over-medicalize things and the issues with transmedicalism, which is still alive and well today. I don't think that he was entirely a transmedicalist or what we would consider to be transmedicalists today. He just kind of like teetered a little, and I think it's an interesting thing to bring into this conversation. Just to define our terms here, transmedicalism is defined by Wikipedia as the idea that being transgender is primarily a medical issue related to the incongruence between an individual's assigned sex at birth and their gender identity, characterized by gender dysphoria. Central to this idea is the fact that you need to feel like you were born in the wrong body in order to be trans, meaning that your transness must cause you discomfort, that you must want to alter your appearance, and that gender is hardwired into biology. The thing is, this understanding of transness is not inherently wrong. It is the very simple one that we explain to people who don't really get it. It's easy to just be like, this person was born in this body but feels like this, so they change their body and they match and now they're happy. It feels very neatly into the binary understanding of gender, and it makes a lot of logical sense. You don't really need to completely rethink and reconstruct your idea of gender in order to fully comprehend it. The problem is that it's not super nuanced. It usually ignores people who identify outside of the binary, like myself, and it also hinges on the idea of a male and a female brain, which we've also talked thoroughly about before. That's not a thing. There is virtually no evidence that there are significant differences between brains based on gender. It also denies the fact that gender is a social construct, because to many, they interpret that idea to mean that gender dysphoria is solely caused by society's rules and expectations, and that a trans person would not be trans in another society without these rules and expectations, which is a hypothetical that nobody knows the answer to, so it's kind of a moot point. But that idea often hinges on a lack of understanding around the idea of social construct, i.e., the fact that something is an arbitrary category created by society does not mean that our struggles as a result of that arbitrary category are not super real and valid. Sometimes people hear the sentence, "this thing is a social construct," to mean your struggles aren't real, and then get very defensive about it. It happens. I talked about autism being a social construct in one of my videos, and like half my comments are people yelling at me about it. I get it. It's hard to comprehend and understand, but it still is objective fact. Anyway, the other issue is that this idea makes somebody's transness solely related to their dysphoria, or their discomfort around a mismatch between assigned gender and gender identity, which often paints our view of trans identities as an inherently negative experience, a journey that is centered around struggle and pain. And now, I'm gonna be fully honest. I often hear people say, you can be trans without dysphoria, and I was always like, yeah, you can, I guess. But I never really understood that concept, and given that I've never met a trans person who has not struggled with dysphoria, I didn't entirely believe it. But I watched a really great video on transmedicalism that's linked in the description that you should watch by Cops Hate Mo. Wonderful channel, by the way. Where they use the example of a haircut. Say that somebody had long hair and was happy with long hair forever. One day they go to a salon, they decide to cut it all off, and they get a pixie cut. And they look in the mirror and they go, wow, I feel so much more like me. I don't think I ever want to have long hair again. They weren't distressed by having long hair. They just felt more them with short hair. Some trans people only experience that. Some people in general only experience that. I'm realizing that I was the same way I have naturally straight hair, and I started curling it, and I was like, this is life-changing, and now I don't like having straight hair. Even though I used to never mind it when I was younger. And all of this is normal, and it happens, and we shouldn't declare who is or is not trans based on who struggles with their dysphoria and who does not experience it, or who experiences it and doesn't struggle with it. But where transmedicalism gets most uncomfy for me is that it very much hinges on, hey, trans people are valid and should be treated like humans because their transness is biological and natural. Because I don't think that our ability to accept people as people and our willingness to treat them like human beings should rely on whether we can biologically categorize that person or scientifically prove that they are normal or that people like them are naturally occurring. I know that I'm the kind of person who likes to go down medical rabbit holes. I'll be the first to say that when I see scientific proof of something I do being normal, I feel very warm and fuzzy inside. I've made a lot of videos on this channel breaking down studies into various aspects of disability that normalize the things that we do, so I'm gonna acknowledge that my take on this is a bit hypocritical, but also two things can be true at once, and we can want and think more than one thing about something at once, if that makes sense. As humans, we really love to name and categorize things, and we see science as objective truth. And humans inherently seek things that are objective truth, that are solid guidelines to help sway what we think about things, to give us guidelines and understandings. So we are drawn to science to explain how we exist as people. The thing is that we know time and time again that science and general academia very often are not objective truth in the slightest. They have just as much of a racist, sexist, ableist, every other ist you can think of past as anything else. But what we get caught up in, and what Hirschfeld was very caught up in, is the idea that if we have the right science about minority people, if we have the right facts and the right data, that will convince certain people of the humanity of those people. It will convince people to give us equal rights, to treat us like people. It will make the world a better place if we have the proof that we are real. And the more of a historian I become, the more research I do, the more I realize that people who want to believe certain facts to be true will believe certain facts to be true regardless of the data. The people who want to deny the humanity of other people are going to do so regardless of data. And medicalizing and pathologizing everything, while in the short term may help explain things to some people and make the minority people feel more seen, it can also very easily tip into the, cool, so we have a name for it, now we can fix it and make it go away. And it's a very slippery slope and a really tricky nuance to think about and play with, and one that has been on my mind a lot as I've been making this video, because Hirschfeld was so consumed by finding biological bases for behavior because he thought that it would give people rights, and the small pieces of it that he did end up finding ended up changing things for a very tiny group of people and making a much larger group of people consider him to be a crazy person and made him the scapegoat of Nazi Germany, and led us to a point where all of this gathered information about people like us was lost forever and we were forced into the shadows once again. I'm not saying that it's his fault or like that he should have conformed or that he shouldn't have done what he did. I am so grateful for all the work that he did and the impact he had in society, and I wish that he was named and appreciated more than he is. But I've been thinking a lot about how we consider so many aspects of the human experience legitimate only when we find specific pathologized ways to describe them, and that a level of pathologization is different when used within a community to understand each other versus outside of that community to try and pathologize us. And can we create one without the other? That I don't know. To me, based on Hirschfeld's writings, it doesn't seem like he felt that way. It seems like he felt that all people were people who deserved to be happy and lived their best lives in whatever way that looked like to them, but also knew the wider world would not believe that and hoped that scientific fact would be an alternate way to get the same outcome. And I don't think he was wrong in reading humanity that way. It just makes me reflect a lot on humanity and how we can cope with differences and how we can demedicalize and decolonize our thoughts and concepts, if that's even possible. I don't know. And all of this feels especially prescient right now given the rise of anti-trans rhetoric and legislation, and learning about what happened in Weimar Germany and looking at today's politics. It's very freaky to see the parallels and wonder, what can we learn from this to do better this time? To which I don't really have answers. But I do think that knowing about this and talking about this and telling these stories is an important part of that, an important part of preserving our history and our people and learning from the things that happened in the past. Knowing that people like us have always existed and always will exist, and that over 100 years ago, a guy saw our struggles and tried to help and made a tremendous difference in the lives of people like us both then and now. A lot of anti-trans stuff right now hinges on the idea that we are something newfangled and scary and we are a growing threat, but we're not. We have significant proof of that, and that's important. There are two thoughts that have been bouncing around my brain that I kind of want to leave this video on, both from the epilogue of Before We Were Trans, which again, you should read it. I really wish I could take all the tenets of that book and how it handles race and class and language that I couldn't get into in this video and shove it into a video for you, but I don't think that's gonna work, so just go read it. The first thought is quoted from Jen Shaplin's book, My Autobiography of Carson McCullers, about how queer history is often disseminated into lists of here's a list of historical lesbians you maybe didn't know about, and nothing more, but that's no longer really in style given that the complexities and nuances of using modern labels for historical people are sketchy at best, but then follows that up by saying, there's a part of me, a defiant and somewhat juvenile part that still wants the list. The second thought is about history and from the author, but I feel like it also very much applies, interestingly, to scientific and medicalized concepts as well. The discipline of history isn't supposed to leave much room for emotion. We're supposed to be ruthlessly objective, dispassionately surveying the evidence. It's easy to assume that emotional engagement leads to bad history, to riding roughshod over the experiences of people in the past and having regard only for our own feelings. But for me, emotional connection to those past people is not just tolerable, it's necessary. Because it's what leads us to care enough to take the time to know people in other times and cultures on their own gendered terms. It's what leads us to remember that these people are people, deserving of a humanizing historiography that declines to display their bodies to the world and works determinedly to oppose the racist ideologies that have long tried to deny them humanity. So I will leave this video here. I would love to know your thoughts about all of it in the comments. Thank you to Hirschfeld and our trans ancestors for paving the way for us to be able to exist today. And I hope that the fierce activism of our communities to make things better for the next generation would make them proud. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it is never too late to start over. And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.